It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by Agile Dad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. Well, I know what you're thinking. Why not keep going since we've been on this path of anti patterns all week, talking about different things that are just really inherently weird about Scrum or Agile? Let's continue down that path. So, we all understand the INVEST model. This was made popular by William Wake or Bill Wake. And INVEST, for those of you who aren't familiar, the I stands for independent, the N's negotiable, the V is valuable, the E is estimable because estimatable is not a word. The S is sized appropriately, and the T is testable. And I think that while this is a great model for identifying work and trying to determine whether work is ready or meets a definition of ready, it also has its quirks. So there was a recent article that was published in January by Kevin Bendeler, and someone reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you mind reviewing that article and talking about those three quirks?" So, in keeping with our trend for this week, I thought it would be good for us to talk about misconceptions or to talk about things regarding the three quirks. So, the first quirk comes with the letter S, which is sized appropriately. So if you think about sized appropriately, I've been challenged and asked a question. So what does that mean, sized appropriately? And I'm like, well, I suppose if I had to break it down into something more simple, I would say small in size, small in scope, right? And still, small is an interesting word. Does small mean that it's small in the grand scheme of things? Does it mean as small as possible? Does it mean we're breaking things down to a very small task level or even more minutia? Does small mean small in scope of the project? Does small mean, there's so many different ways to look at small, right? And I suppose, as an example, or for example's sake, if I said small in the grand scheme of building a Lego set compared to small in the grand scheme of building a skyscraper, one could easily argue that those two definitions of small are on far opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So, small, when you're talking about small or sized appropriately, are you running a risk of losing value by trimming off all the edges and ending up with something that really doesn't make sense? Or are you adding things on without regard and doing gold plating because you can still say it's small in size? And let's not forget also that are we doing layered small or are we doing a vertical slice small? So when you're doing a vertical slice small, are you considering things like user experience, user interface, service layers, data layers, on top of all of the user layers? Are you considering all these things working together and considering a small across all those layers? Or are you just saying small for the sake of being small because it's easily consumable? And I think that sized appropriately or small could be confusing if someone calls you out and asks you to perfectly identify it. So, just for value, the only way that I found that's easy for people to understand small is to come in with a preconceived notion or the bias, and I can't believe I'm telling people to have bias, but in this case I am, that small is going to be relative based on the type of work you're doing and who's performing the work. So, for example, to a group of plumbers, a small project wouldn't be the same as that project would be to a group of painters or vice versa, right? So, as each group works on something, even if they are cross threading and cross pollinating and completing something start to finish, even if they're not, component based teams and they are feature based teams, I think it's important for us to recognize that sized appropriately means that we're going to do what we can to make it as consumable as possible where it still delivers value. So, there you go. That's an interesting one. How about we jump to the T real quick? Testable. What does testable really mean? Are we talking about testing at the unit level? Are we talking about automated tests? Are we talking about acceptance tests? Are we talking about load tests, stress tests? I can go down a list with you, right? And depending on whether we're building a product, a service, technical or non technical, testing can mean something totally different. So I think testable in a blockchain environment is going to be completely different than testable in an environment where we're manufacturing something, right? Or providing a service. And I think that sometimes we need to come to the realization that although we're not going to be able to have a perfect definition, much like the definition is sized appropriately, we need to base our testable definition on the type of work that we're doing and the people who are going to be doing the work. And if we do that, we can have this make sense. We can have this be something that's easily consumable based on the fact that, hey, we understand how and why it needs to be tested, and we understand what the expected outcome is. And I think that this is mainly to drive us to an outcome centered focus instead of just an output centered focus. We want to make sure that we understand why the outcome that we hope to achieve is important, and we want to make sure that we have a way to track against that. So, in that sense, testable makes a lot more sense. Finally, the third quirk is sometimes people say, and I've heard people say this, that estimable versus negotiable, that those two are opposites of each other, or those two don't jive well together. Well, the difference between those two is a little bit vague because negotiable uh, doesn't apply to a team, so to speak, when estimable does. When a story is estimable, it means that the team can put an estimation on it using t-shirt size, etc., right? But it means that the story complies with the definition of ready and that it's ready to go. Negotiable means that the story is not too specific for its own good. When a story is not yet into a sprint, we want to make sure we're able to refine it and do backlog grooming so that we can make sure the stakeholders and the team see if there's hidden value or ways that you can optimize or make the story easier to implement. So I think sometimes when you're talking about these, you need to understand the difference in order to understand that the quirk's not there. So in this case, they do mean two totally different things. But I think sometimes people think that negotiable means you're negotiating the estimate or you're negotiating the size when it's not the case at all. Much like people think estimable means that you can estimate whether or not it can fit in a sprint, or whether what the scope is, and based on the scope, and that ties directly to negotiable. The two are separate things and the two can be tracked independently. So I think that even if you look up the definition of negotiable, you come back with open to discussion or modification, right? Discussable, flexible. And I think that if you look at it that way, it makes sense. So invest is such an important thing. And I don't think Bill Wake meant for it to be difficult. I think that we as humans have made it more difficult than it actually is by trying to hyper dissect what it actually means. But I think that if you overcome those three quirks, that you can really help your organization take things to the place it needs to be. I hope you found this useful as always, and it was a great article, Kevin. Congratulations. As usual, if you have something you'd like for us to review or talk about, shoot us over an email, learn more at agiledad.com. We'd love to talk about what you want to hear us talk about. As always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.